Hello and welcome to Green Shift, where we try to make sense of sustainability. I'm your host, David Austin, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Victor Nguyen, founding co-chair of the Center for Strategic Energy and Resources, CSER. Our guest today is James Balzer. James is an Australian strategic foresight practitioner, helping businesses and government navigate complex governance and regulatory challenges, including in climate change and sustainability. James is an adjunct fellow at Macquarie University, a guest lecturer at Waseda University, and a visiting lecturer at the Institute for Environment and Sustainability at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And James is also one of CSER's affiliated experts who will be conducting an online workshop called Diagnosing Governance Dysfunctions in Carbon Capture and Storage Regulation in Indonesia on the 30th of October at 2 p.m. Singapore time. And we'll put all the contact details in the show notes, or you can go to cser.energy. We discussed the workshop and James' research on CCS in this interview. And Victor, you described the concept of CCS in the interview, but could you maybe tell us more about the tech behind it? How does it actually work? Because we never actually discussed it, and I think a lot of people may not know. I did not know.
There are a few ways you can achieve carbon capture. Broadly speaking, we classify them as pre-combustion capture, post-combustion capture, and oxy-fuel combustion. So pre-combustion capture, as the name suggests, we try to capture CO2 before the fossil fuel is burned. And so in reality, what really happens is that we convert that fossil fuel into a form, for example, converting coal into hydrogen or converting natural gas into hydrogen, and then take out the carbon component through carbon capture. Right? And then the rest goes into the power plant or going to the industrial part, pure hydrogen. So that is where there won't be any CO2 emission during the burning process. So that's pre-combustion capture. In post-combustion capture, we burn the fossil fuel, and then there will be CO2 in the exhaust pipes or in the chimneys. So the most common one is to use a solvent or amine-based solvent. So essentially it's a chemical. Just simply think about it as passing CO2 through a pipe into a chemical, and then the chemical then absorbs all the CO2 from the mixture, from the gas mixture. So the rest of the non-greenhouse gas would then be released, provided they also meet the environmental discharge standard or environmental emission standard. So CO2 is then kept in the solvent for subsequent treatment. That's post-combustion capture. Oxy-fuel combustion is similar to post-combustion capture. So in a normal combustion process, the fuel is mixed with just air. We mix with normal air for burning. Whereas in oxy-fuel combustion, we actually use oxygen. So the end result, it will lead to a much higher CO2 concentration in the final emission composition. And it makes the carbon capture more efficient.
And I wanted to mention one other thing we talk about in the interview, which is the JET-P, which stands for the Just Energy Transition Partnership. We called it project, I think, in the discussion, but it's partnership. It's basically a way for developed economies to help fund developing countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and South Africa on their energy transition. So with that, here's our interview with James. James Balzer, thank you so much for joining us. It's good to see you.
Pleasure's mine, David and Victor. It's always good to talk about this very important and complex topic.
It is complex, and that's why I'm going to start by asking Victor to simply describe carbon capture and storage to us. How do you look at it from the technical side, but how do you explain it to mere humans such as I?
Well, then I try to speak human language when we talk about carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Usually that's the abbreviation that people use, CCUS. So carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Some people call it sequestration. So really put it simply, what it means is that capture the CO2 from an emitter, be it a coal-fired power plant or a cement plant or whatever factories that is burning fossil fuel, capture that CO2 from the smokestack and then bring it either to utilization, for example, making into building materials, making into alternative fuel like methanol. And maybe the other way, if let's say we don't go for the utilization, then we may be simply storing them underground. Say, for example, in a depleted oil field, or maybe in saline aquifers, right? So that achieves the purpose of preventing the CO2 from emitting into the atmosphere. So in other words, since we're digging out fossil fuel and burning them, let's return the fossil fuel back into the ground in this carbon dioxide form. So in a nutshell, that's what CCS or CCUS is doing.
Mm-hmm. And how prevalent is it so far? How successful is it so far, in your opinion, Victor?
I mean, CCUS is not a new approach, or rather, CCS is not a new technology. It's been around for decades, and quite a number of projects are already running, mostly running the utilization. So one form of utilization is enhanced oil recovery or enhanced gas recovery. We call that EOR or EGR. So what it means is that you use CO2 to inject into the oil well or gas well to help recover more gas or oil out of it. So this is the most common practice of CO2 utilization. Are there storage projects? Yeah, there has been several CCS or carbon capture and storage projects. Some are commercial, but most of them are in the pilot or demonstration stage. Some are larger, some are smaller. I mean, if you look at it from a global perspective, CCS is no longer a new technology. We can almost call it a proven technology, a proven approach. But the question remains is cost, regulation, and whether this, sometimes people call it greenwashing when it comes to CCS. So a lot of the other non-technical factors that's affecting the adoption of CCS.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's where James comes in, because we wanted to talk to him. He's been doing a lot of research about CCS, specifically in the Indonesian context, and talking about a lot of those challenges you just brought up. So, James, why don't you tell us what you've been working on? Why is Indonesia such an important place to focus on right now? And what have you found? And what are these kind of research problems you're working on at the moment?
Well, I think Victor did a very good summary, and CCS is really a good way of enabling the net zero. Because net zero, we talk about that term a lot. What it really means is, can you absorb, capture, or maybe capture the carbon to the extent that you emit, right? So there's a zero part of net zero, which is all about reducing emissions in the first place. And there's the net part, which is about balancing emissions that go into the atmosphere with sequestration. So where CCS comes in, it's a really good way to bridge carbon intensive economies, particularly in the developing world, into a net zero future, because it enables that net function. So Indonesia is really important because it's a really fast growing economy. It's the 8th biggest emitter in the world, and it's the 4th most populous country in the world. And it's one of the fastest growing economies in the world and one of the fastest growing regions of the world, right? So just those headline statistics alone indicate it's going to be a major emitter moving forward as it grows and it has become more wealthy. And it's not going to achieve net zero through wind and solar alone in the next 25 years. Or 24 and a half, to be really specific. It's going to need those transitional technologies like carbon capture and storage to realistically achieve its net zero ambitions. And Indonesia is one case of that, but there's a lot of other developing countries where that's the case. So we do have to embrace CCS in that particular context.
What are the geopolitical and mega trends and economic trends that are acting on Indonesia right now that are affecting the implementation of CCS?
One of the big challenges right now is that America for a long time has been a climate leader, or at least under Biden it really was, with the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, and relevant sort of tax concessions and grants and subsidies under that, including a lot of areas in that IRA about carbon capture and storage, and actually government subsidizing and supporting that. And that really gave America a real leg up and a real global leadership role in actually being a global leader in CCS, and in addition to many other climate fields. Now, because the IRA is going to be repealed most likely, and its component parts are going to fall to pieces, you really have to look to other major economies in the world, and especially major population centers in the global south, to be leaders in carbon capture and storage. In the lead up to COP30, we need to really think about that more critically. The global south are, increasingly major emitters in the world economy. They're increasingly growing in population, growing in their economy size, and yet they're also some of the most carbon intensive economies in terms of their energy mix. So how can the global south, particularly somewhere like Indonesia, be the new leader in carbon capture and storage technology in light of the retreat of America and frankly other global north actors as well?
What would it take to make that happen? We all want Indonesia to step up and take this leadership role, but how likely do you see it happening, and what can outside forces, whether it's civil society or neighboring countries or, general media attention, what can we do to help nudge that along?
So one of the major challenges I think Indonesia faces is really coherent regulation, particularly with regard to their ability to enforce regulation as well. So Indonesia is an interesting case because they actually do now have some legislation to manage carbon capture and storage. In 2024, they had presidential regulation number 14, which was actually a basic legal framework for carbon capture and storage. But there are concerns with regard to how specific it really is and to the extent to which the government actually has the means to enforce it, including the policy instruments like fiscal incentives or carbon pricing that actually enable the market to uptake interest in carbon capture and storage and really embrace it as a legitimate, robust net zero pathway for Indonesia. So you've got the challenge whereby government can be very sort of engage in legal governance, be very corporatist and very top down. And that's one way you could consider actually enabling carbon capture and storage in Indonesia is very much government carrying a heavy stick and enacting that presidential regulation under, a very coercive, big stick manner. Or it could be more of a carrot for markets and for civil society as well to engage in social license for the uptake of CCS, particularly as it engages with communities that depend on employment in carbon-intensive industries as well. So I think one of the sort of key things to understand is that Indonesia is at a bit of a crossroads. Yes, it has the legal framework under that presidential regulation I just mentioned before, number 14 from 2024. But how do you make sure that we actually enact it in a way that, number one, is robust and actually has good government command and control, good monitoring and evaluation mechanisms, but at the same time, not so overbearing that it just weighs down market actors from engaging with CCS in Indonesia, and instead actually is a market shaper, not just a sort of market corrector. And that's really important that Indonesia considers that moving forward. Government, civil society, and markets are the three main actors in policymaking, including in CCS. How does regulation properly balance the role of those actors in that ecosystem?
I think what James is pointing out is really important. I think in the whole of CCS, the key is not about technology. It is really about, first of all, the perception of this technology. And then when you do deploy these technology or measure, what you really do to ensure that CO2 stays underground. And also what you really do to ensure justice when it comes to deployment. Along those lines, for example, regulating, measurement, reporting, and verifications of CO2 storage, making sure that the companies are doing a proper carbon capture, and then bringing the CO2 down to a proper place to do storage. That in itself is a huge challenge. And then again, on the storage itself, there are issues, for example, in the Indonesian context, you have the issue with land permitting, you have the issue with land ownership, project ownership, and then, putting ourselves a bit higher up, in the shoes of policymaker, then you also have to worry about how do you ensure, not literally from the insurance point of view, how do you ensure a project that will be storing the CO2 for the next 100 years? Can you guarantee that nothing's going to happen? There's no leakage whatsoever, no accident whatsoever. And if you can really do all that, then there's really a case for CCS in Indonesia. But the thing is that, every single step, as what we are looking at in terms of CCS deployment, there are challenges. And I want to really emphasize again, none of these are technological challenges. There are technologies of engineering measures that can solve all that, but it's the human aspect, the policy, the regulation, the governance that always makes things difficult. And actually, I want to stretch this point a little bit. CCS, the idea of CCS is to decarbonize fossil fuel, right? I'll try to bring close enough to net zero as much as possible. But then again, you also have companies and environmental groupings that will say that this is just an excuse to continue using coal. Because if you can theoretically capture 100% of CO2 emission from coal-fired power plant, then CCS basically allows coal to continue in their fuel mix, where in the world we're living, we wanted to phase out coal and eventually phase out fossil fuel. So are we playing another game that is trying to prolong the life of fossil fuel while we say CCS is the way to save the world? Mm-hmm. I think that is something interesting. I've been hearing that all the time.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to avoid that sort of conclusion. James, how do you view that? Do you see this as transitional technology, or do you think it could become like a slippery slope where it becomes an excuse to just continue fossil fuel production under a cleaner name?
Well, I think it's a transitional methodology. What's important to keep in mind is just being realistic. 24 and a half years to 2050. We're all talking about net zero by 2050. As of 2021, Moody's reported 31% of Indonesia's on-balance loans were to industries in high carbon transition risk, coal, gas, etc. Right? It's a lot of credit that's been given to carbon-intensive industries. Number one, that means they've got to transition away from fossil fuels, and there is a risk that they recognize. But number two, at the same time, right, there's a reality they have to reconcile with that. Coal mining employs, hundreds of thousands of Indonesians. I think about 250,000 Indonesians, according to the IEA, and also it's the vast majority of its energy system is based on coal and gas, right? So yes, it has lots of carbon transition risk it's going to experience in the new energy economy. However, there's also big social and economic impacts of just transitioning too quickly without using it as a bridging technology, right? So I think in that sense, it's very important that it's a bridging technology. I think there are limitations for it being a longer term solution, and we get into that later if you want. But at the same time, I'm not one of these people who decries it as just a way of arbitrarily expanding the life of coal-fired power plants and gas. I think it does serve an important practical purpose between now and 2050. I might also add as well, Indonesia's sustainable finance taxonomy does actually sort of put out a large amount of categories that are called the yellow categories that are for transitional technologies like carbon capture and storage. So it's even the financial taxonomy for sustainable finance in Indonesia can see that transitional technologies are necessary. And if that's sort of the dictate that that's where sustainable finance can and is allowed to go in Indonesia, that sustainable finance taxonomy is a market signal. And inevitably, that's where the market's going to be putting money as well. So there are just some pragmatic realities you have to concede to from an economic and a regulatory standpoint. But at the same time, that's not to say we sort of eschew achieving net zero ambitions in the next 24 years.
Mm-hmm. Now, I can certainly see the social aspect, and the fact that it does employ so many people. And I'm not an expert in Indonesia, but I've heard this brought up in other discussions by other people who are, also just talking about the vested interest of coal as part of the political economy in Indonesia as being a particularly thorny problem. So what do you think about that, and what have you kind of outlined as ways to address it?
Well, I think one of the issues in Indonesia is the PLN really dominates the landscape. It's a state-owned enterprise, a state-owned monopoly, right? That controls 100% of transmission, 100% of distribution, and about 60 to 70% of total energy users use energy from the PLN, I believe, or something to that effect. But the fact of the matter is it dominates the entire landscape in Indonesia. So this is a real concern because new market entrants that want to be competitive, that want to have competitive technologies and pricing, that's a real problem. You can't have that in a system that's monopolized by a state-owned enterprise. And so when you're talking about Indonesia, you have to keep that in mind. Now, it's a monopoly, yes. It's one thing to have a private sector monopoly, but it's one thing to have a state-owned enterprise monopoly like the PLN is. Inevitably, that means there is a lot of invested political interests in the PLN, and people who get promoted to the top of the PLN are serving often the administration of the day's own agenda and interests, which means there is politicization of energy policy in Indonesia. So that's a really important thing to consider when you're trying to think about transitional pathways for Indonesia's energy economy. It is run by a state-owned enterprise that is a monopoly that owns all of transmission, all of distribution, and most households use energy from it. So, read between the lines.
Yeah. And then also, I don't want to, miss the fact that here we are three non-Indonesians talking about this from the outside. But yeah, Victor, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Yeah, actually, that's exactly our point, right? This is what CSER has always been advocating for. When we talk about energy transition, we know where we want to get to. I mean, net zero emissions or 100% renewable clean energy, whatever you call that future, we know we are transitioning to. But very, very often, people don't talk about where we are transitioning from. And that is the fossil system that we are very much reliant on today. Right? I mean, when we talk about energy security, that is not referring to renewables. Energy security refers to fuels that we can get in the ways that we are familiar with. Although there's geopolitics, there's other issues, but we are familiar and we know how to deal with them. And that's, fossil fuel. Like maybe some people will talk about nuclear, but that's a different topic. And also we shouldn't forget that everything we know today, call it energy economy or energy market. This term comes from fossil fuel. This term doesn't come from renewable. This term doesn't come from hydrogen or any exotic fuels that we're talking about today. Energy market is on top of fossil market. And we have our energy market, the trading, and then the electricity market. And that's what makes up of our economy. So, if you talk about just energy transition, we shouldn't forget the economic dimension. I mean, environment is just part of it, right? There is people, there is the economy, and without these two, there's no meaning to talk about energy transition. And of course, by saying that, I'm not saying that CCS is the most glorious thing to do. It is a technology that needs to be in the mix. I mean, if you think about a portfolio approach, I think we should not rule out CCS. And then to James' point, yes, CCS or the yellow brownish color is in the taxonomy. It is also in the ASEAN taxonomy version number 2. So we can actually finance decarbonization project for coal-fired power plant. And it doesn't mean replacing them. Could be CCS, could be efficiency improvement. And that's exactly addressing the regional or, individual countries' circumstances in ASEAN.
Well, I think Victor's made a really good point. And the way to think about regulation is, I use what's called the futures triangle, right? And you've got the pull from the future. That's net zero, right? Like we all know what that is. That's the objective, the mission we're working towards. And I would say I want to call it the triangle is the push from the present. That's the impact of climate change. That's the transitional and physical risk we're trying to avoid. Great. We all know that. So we can know that well. Like we know what the issue we're running away from. We know what we're trying to run to. But then the other corner of the triangle is the weight of history, right? So that is things like the dominance of a state-run monopoly in Indonesia. That is things like a dependence on coal mining and coal exports for employment and economic growth, et cetera, et cetera. And so Victor made a very good point. We need to be very cognizant of what we're transitioning away from, not just what we're transitioning to. And you can't be ahistorical about the future. If you want to identify a future and work towards it, you have to be very cognizant of where you're coming from. That's the historical part you have to be aware of.
And on the pathway there, James, I know you're kind of looking at the current governance framework surrounding CCS in Indonesia. Do you want to walk us through what you found in your research and what you're trying to
Absolutely.
study and forward at this time?
So going back to the point as discussed earlier about governance and regulation, we need to think about regulation and the way we assess regulation in two ways, right? There's two sort of governance failures that we need to avoid. So number one is we need to avoid what's known as first order governance failures. That is basically where is the actual regulation we're implementing, is it designed to actually address the necessary incentive structure required to get buy-in from the right people. So I mentioned before, you can have very corporatist modes of governance. That's a governance mode that can work if you're talking about very much a sort of problem that needs not much incentive because there's not a lot of carrot, but it needs a lot of stick. And a corporatist governance is basically sort of, creating a toxic regulation permit system, for example, where the government comes in with a big stick and has an authority and a regulated exchange that says, this is what needs to be done. These are the rules. This is what you're doing. Do it, right? And it's driven by stick, not carrot. Alternatively, you might design a regulation around something that really requires not a lot of coercion. It just needs a lot of incentive, right? That's the opposite, where you just need a lot of carrot. And the government needs to sort of be a market shaper, shape that carrot. It really helps sort of create a pull from the future, to go back to the futures triangle, that the market wants to work towards. And the regulations are designed to create certainty and directionality for the economy. And so that's sort of market governance, right? Which is based more on sort of trying to institute new market reforms through subsidies, grants, loans from the government, et cetera, that sort of provide a market signal to move society towards a particular direction. So that's sort of the governance, first order governance failure would be not designing regulation that is aligned to the incentive structure required. But that is really important. We have to make sure we consider that in depth when we're designing regulations for CCS in Indonesia and other places as well. The second order governance failure, which you must also consider, is the ability to actually implement and resource the actual regulation you design. So if you actually design a market-based governance mode for CCS in Indonesia, you need to have really strong analytical capacity within government that can actually analyze and evaluate and do monitoring, reporting and verification of carbon capture and storage projects and their veracity and their financing over the long term. So government needs to have what some would call sort of policy analytical capacity, right? So in other words, second order governance failure is where you might have the incentive structure figured out, but, and this is important, the government themselves don't necessarily have the right governance capacity to actually manage the regulation. So, for example, with corporatist governance, you need lots of political organizational resource capacity, a bunch of regulators in government who are very well trained, very legally savvy, you have the right sort of authority and stick. If they don't have that, then yeah, you might have the right incentive structure, but you're not going to enforce any regulation. Presidential Order number 14, 2024 that I mentioned before, is a good start, but it's a bit vague on both those governance fronts. It sort of provides a framework which might encourage market actors to enter and might encourage market governance, but it's not entirely sort of certain around the exact direction to which CCS will dominate the Indonesian energy sector, for example. It doesn't necessarily deal also with issues of second order governance failure, like is the PLN too dominant and having too much of a say in a way that discourages market entrance, for example? Probably, yeah. But the regulation doesn't really deal with that. So there's a major second order governance failure there. So one of the things I'm really trying to do research into is, can we actually take this framework of first and second order governance failures, apply it to the presidential Order number 14, 2024, and really begin to think about analyzing CCS regulation in Indonesia through the lens of first and second order governance failures.
Yeah, and I know that's currently a research project you're hoping to get off the ground. So you don't have the answers to that yet, but just by stating the problem like that, Victor, what can we learn and what kind of potential does Indonesia have to rise to these challenges?
What I can say is I think Indonesia is well set up to go towards CCS. The country has passed laws and bills on CCS regulations, which actually make them the first country in ASEAN to actually have a CCS specific regulation. The country is doing several pilots. You have international partners like Exxon, JOGMEC, that are very actively exploring carbon storage projects or CO2 sequestration projects. So, from that perspective of international partner investment, you have that star aligned. From the regulatory point of view, yes, the regulations is there. I mean, of course, we can scrutinize the details, whether it is a robustly designed set of regulation, other loopholes, other issues, but it is already there. At least there's a baseline to work with as compared to many other countries. Do they have sufficient regulatory capacity? It's a very big question that we need to explore. And I think that's exactly what the study needs to find out. And if indeed the answer is not so much, then the next question comes in. So what can we do? The we basically refers to, for example, universities, research organizations, NGOs like ourselves. What can we do to help government of Indonesia or any country build up that capacity to be able to design and regulate and essentially manage CCS projects in the country efficiently? Then again, right, that's my point, right? It's not technology, but if you don't manage the technology right, well, carbon capture may becomes, a more carbon intensive process for all you know. So that's where, we are hoping that Indonesia will be on the right track, and, capacity building, policy capacity building is indeed the way to go. Where they are now, I think the government folks or the people in Indonesia will know better than us. But based on what we are observing, I think they are a lot more fortunate as compared to many other countries in terms of international support, participation, and also having the CCS policy and regulations laid out.
Well, I think the presidential regulation from last year was a really good start, right? And that's really quite seminal and really sort of sets a good threshold. And I've echoed Victor's. It's not all a bad news story by any means, but it's still room for scrutiny nonetheless. And so, in many respects, Indonesia is a good case study of CCS in the global south, particularly within ASEAN, and at least is sort of attempting to really build a good regulatory framework, even if there are issues and concerns around it. And it's something that at least provides space for experimentation. One of sort of the, I think, good examples of where this has happened previously is the Gundih CCS project in Central Java. So it was actually led by Pertamina and supported by international partners like JOGMEC, which Victor mentioned, and LPEM, UI. And so it was a real good flagship demonstration of Indonesia's CCS potential. And that's something that happened a number of years ago. It was a really good trial exercise in CCS in Indonesia and was largely relatively successful. But once again, as I mentioned, did experience some of those first and second order governance failures I mentioned earlier. So that was a project that is sort of heralded as a good sort of inroads into CCS in Indonesia. In terms of the current administration, I'm yet to kind of see or witness kind of a major project be launched or at least completed in Indonesia by the current administration. But what you hope is they learn from the lessons of Gundih and the experience they had there. So I think this presidential regulation is really going to help provide a good framework moving forward and will hopefully actually provide clear legal provisions regarding permits, liability, long-term monitoring, and carbon ownership for CCS operations in ways that the Gundih project didn't really have because it was before this regulation. And so making sure that there's no sort of policy vacuum that could lead to also site approvals and also long-term monitoring of plans with regard to carbon leakage or carbon unabatement. But also environmental impacts as well on local biodiversity and water and land management as well.
Do you want to talk about some of the more granular aspects, like the permitting issue, or some of the other issues that you've identified? You want to get into the weeds a bit?
Well, I think there's one of the challenges is there's sort of a permitting is one thing, and that's almost goes back to second order governance failure, which is about government having a real sort of ability to control and manage regulations on this Gundih CCS project. One of the things I think that's probably worth mentioning is the lack of a emissions trading scheme that around this project, which meant there wasn't sort of the market incentive or market buy-in to kind of engage in CCS at the time, and still there's lag in that respect. Going back to first order governance failures, with CCS, if you want to get the market involved, you have to provide the incentives and actually get them interested, subsidies, provide regulations for carbon trading and so forth. And if you're not going to provide a good framework for that to accompany CCS regulation, like was the case for the Gundih project, then you actually don't have sort of the market incentive to actually build the structure, to actually get the supply and demand necessary to scale up market interest for the long term. So that was one of the major issues with the Gundih project, in that it was hard to scale beyond sort of one project. But that is something over time I hope that gets addressed in Indonesia, because the market will be necessary in order to create long-term prosperity and veracity of carbon capture and storage. But it's also compounded by the fact for that particular project, there was a lack of financial support mechanisms like tax credits, carbon pricing, or subsidies that didn't really de-risk upfront costs. Keeping in mind that CCS projects actually are quite capital intensive, particularly as an upfront cost. So if you can provide tax credits or carbon pricing or subsidies as a way of offsetting upfront costs and de-risking investment from the private sector, or even from government for that matter, to be honest, that's a much better way to sort of really engage in that market governance that really helps engage in a carrot, not just a stick. And so I think there's some lessons you can learn from the Gundih project from a few years ago now that really need to think about moving forward when we design regulations in Indonesia.
Can you describe the Gundih project a little bit more in depth? You know, what was it? What was this pilot project?
It was a project in Central Java. So it was a sort of one of the pilot projects from 2016. It was a pioneering project aimed to capture and inject CO2 from the Gundih gas processing facility in a depleted gas reservoir for permanent geological storage. So this is an example of geological storage. You sort of have a depleted gas reservoir, and you then actually use that reservoir to actually store carbon inside of it. And it's happening in Australia, actually, interestingly enough, as well. So one of the big interests in projects like that is that it is something that companies overseas can actually sell their sort of carbon to be stored underground, or their excess sort of gas or excess carbon intensive products can be stored underground potentially as well. So there is sort of actual market incentive to engage in these projects. But as I said, there's got to be de-risking to make it happen and make it viable. But that's sort of a good overview of the Gundih CCS project and the context within which it sits in the broader CCS landscape to this day.
And when you talk about de-risking, is that on the finance side? Is that like a blended finance? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Particularly, once again, the upfront costs.
I think you've done a good job of giving us kind of the overall concept, but it is fairly theoretical. So I'd like you to maybe just walk us through how would you think that CCS could be used in the most optimum way if everything went right?
Number one is we have to be looking at the actual integration with existing energy transition policies and initiatives in Indonesia. So already you have the JETP, for example. That's a Just Energy Transition project, which is basically the $20 billion project to help Indonesia transition away from fossil fuels while reducing the social and economic impacts of that transition, right? But right now, I'm yet to see a lot of integration of CCS in that, and CCS as a mechanism to enable that just transition. So we're not just sort of, going to move from coal-fired power plants or gas processing facilities into wind turbines, batteries, and solar and wind farms overnight, but rather we can sort of use CCS as a bridge that enables a reasonably paced, moderate transition away from fossil fuels and sort of reduces the economic and social issues there. So I think sort of in terms of a short, medium, and long-term change, I think in the short term, sort of making sure CCS and relevant government regulations like Regulation Number 14, 2024 are integrated with existing policy mechanisms like the JETP is really important, number one. Number two, I think also integrating it with the Energy Transition Mechanism, which is fantastic and a really good initiative by the Asian Development Bank that's currently working with the coal-fired power plant in Kiribati. And once again, can we use CCS, either direct air capture or geological storage for coal-fired power plants in places like Kiribati to help with that transition? Possibly. So I think there's sort of room in the short term, and this would be sort of a nice sort of low-hanging fruit. A quick win is to integrate CCS regulations more closely with existing mechanisms for energy transition in Indonesia. Absolutely. I think in sort of the sort of medium term, we really need to see a maturity of carbon trading markets in Indonesia, but also the de-risking instruments like subsidies, grants, and loans and so forth. But also regulations that encourage pro-market activity that once again reduce the risk of that first order governance failure by actually providing regulations that encourage a carrot, that have governments be market shapers, not just market correctors, and correcting market failures, and making sure that the regulations we have a robust policy mix, particularly financing mix that helps de-risk projects and encourage market investment. I also think that involves some level of deregulation of the PLN, because I think right now that sort of government monopoly is a real problem and could prove problematic when actually dealing with energy infrastructure. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind as well. And in the longer term, we need to also then be looking at CCS being a medium-term bridge. So what do you do to sort of move on from CCS into other energy sources as well? And so once again, as Victor sort of alluded to earlier, we've got to think about where we're transitioning from, which is really good, where we're transitioning to in the longer term. And in that spectrum, where does CCS sit within that particular sort of timeline? And then how do we enable best practice sort of uptake of CCS across first and second order governance in order to enable market uptake, monitoring, reporting, and verification, and ultimately a transition to longer term, genuinely zero emissions technologies like battery, solar, hydrogen, and so forth, which in an Indonesian context right now is not going to be the answer, at least to their medium-term transition ambitions.
You mentioned JETP. Hasn't that been weakened a bit by lack of U.S. support, or am I reading too much into that?
Okay. Yeah, and JETP, JETP has been weakened, and unfortunately, a lot of international climate ambition has been dampened by the US, withdrawing from a lot of international engagement, but also even a lot of global north countries. Keep in mind, JETP was funded as a consortium of G7 countries, of which the US is part of. The ETM, the Energy Transition Mechanism, which is what I also mentioned, that's World Bank funded, right? So the $20 billion from the G7 countries has gone into this project, and the US is a massive contributor by not contributing their fair share. Obviously, there's a lot less money to go around. Now, that's a real challenge because once again, markets want certainty. And if you want to sort of encourage market uptake and market entrance into CCS, you need certainty. You also have other G7 countries also withdrawing from their international aid agreements as well. So once again, that inevitably impacts programs like the JETP and the Energy Transition Mechanism. So the question is throwing more money at the problem necessarily the solution? Well, not necessarily. And maybe that's the good news. And so maybe this is also an opportunity to really actively reconsider to what extent we should be depending on foreign nations and foreign aid to run these programs, or to what extent we should consider private sector partners actually coming in and filling the gap in public-private partnerships. So I think there's maybe an opportunity here. There's a bit of a silver lining to explore.
You mentioned entering robust CCS market. You mentioned that earlier. What would that look like, and what would the benefits be?
Well, see, I think for Indonesia, think about the economic trajectory that country is on. It's getting wealthier. It's the fourth biggest population in the world and the fastest growing region of the world in human history, right? Start with those headline details. Just start with the sort of the high level details, right? Now, the question is, Indonesia's also got a massive energy sector and it has its own net zero ambitions, but it's also got sort of guardrails around the financing aspects of its net zero transition, particularly the Indonesian sustainable finance taxonomy, which really prioritizes lots of transitional industries. So what markets need to be thinking about is, how do I sort of get a stake in this sort of ambitious agenda to transition in Indonesia in the next 24 and a half years, as per its climate change legislation, as per its NDCs. But in particular, carbon capture and storage, as indicated by the sustainable finance taxonomy, is going to be part of that journey, and quite a big part of it as well. So how do markets actively engage with CCS? And so there's two ways I think we need to sort of think about this. Number one is, how do we engage the Indonesian government more proactively to really pursue ways in which private sector financiers, through equity, through debt, through various different capital structures, can actively engage with what is quite a regulated, government-dominated market, number one. So I think what would be really great is, in this research project, is to explore ways in which the Indonesian government can refine regulation through the lens of first and second order governance failures to enable not just the entry of market actors, but also make sure that the government has the right capacities to actually manage the regulations in a way that encourages pro-business activity and pro-business investment policies for carbon capture and storage, which is enabled by the sustainable finance taxonomy. So I think one of the big outcomes of this research project will be exploring how private sector can work more closely with the Indonesian government in order to work on engaging CCS, financing it, and through debt or equity or other means, in order to get a stake in that transition in one of the fastest growing economies in the world, in the fastest growing region of the world in human history. That's a really important thing to explore in this research, and should be of interest to a lot of corporate actors, I assume.
That's really a good point. And you're saying 24 years of growth potentially. That's another carrot that's out there, right? As far as and pulling could be a pull factor.
I think really what this study is set up to do is to really help Indonesia accelerate on the pathway to just energy transition, really helping Indonesia attain the carbon net zero as soon as economically feasible. Right? And CCS is definitely one of the key options. And in fact, this study, with all the stakeholders that we lined up, we are really in a good position to be able to help the Indonesian government develop best-in-class CCS regulations, legislatory framework, to really help the country push the limit, and to really help also set an example for the region as a model to replicate CCS regulatory development. And also, more importantly, regulatory capacity building, to really enable the government towards being able to design policy, design regulation, implement it, and enforce it.
And thank you for summing that up so well. I think we've really covered a lot of ground here, and it's a lot to take in because, James, you are getting into the real kind of higher level complex thinking around this problem. And I know most people outside of sort of a small group are not thinking about CCS in Indonesia at this level every day. And I know that one of the things you pointed out, I was reading some of your other research, the kind of public engagement that needs to happen in Indonesia itself is also going to be an ongoing element for many years to get buy-in and just educate people about what's been happening. But before we go, is there anything else that you want to say? Anything else that you would like to touch on that we haven't talked about already?
Look, CCS is it's a pragmatic technology, and I know there are going to be critics of it. I understand that, but we have to be very pragmatic in our ambition towards net zero by 2050. It's only 24 and a half years away. It's not very long. So if we're going to do that, we need to be very pragmatic and almost technologically agnostic, frankly, and results oriented rather in our ambition towards a zero economy. I think CCS falls into that category quite nicely.
Yeah, very good point. Technology agnostic. We can't be too precious about our choices. Yeah. We're running out of time. We have to kind of try everything and put it into that portfolio strategy that Victor's been talking about. Well, thanks so much, James. Thanks for joining us. I really enjoyed this discussion, and we'll be following up with you to see how things go.
Cool. Wonderful. Well, until next time, stay in touch and make sure if you're listening to this, please watch this space. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, and more than happy to liaise about this research if you would like.